The stars outside the viewport had not changed. Vorak stood with his hands clasped behind his back, and stared at the pale blue dot growing slowly in the center of the observation glass. And he told himself what he always told himself before a landing. This is going to be easy. 43 worlds. He had done this 43 times. He knew how it went. You descended in the dark. You made yourself visible. You let the fear do the work. Because fear, true fear, spine fear, the kind that moves your legs before your brain gives the order, that fear was universal. It was the one constant in a galaxy full of variables. Every species that had ever looked up at something too large, too alien, too incomprehensible, had the same response. They broke. The Dominion hadn't conquered 1,000 worlds through violence. Violence was expensive, messy, bad for infrastructure. The Dominion had conquered them through the simple, ruthless application of awe. He looked at the blue dot. Class 2 acquisition target. He almost felt sorry for them. Almost. They came down at 0347, in the dark, into a forest that smelled of pine and cold earth and something older than either. The landing struts touched down without sound. Vorak watched from inside as Grevin led the recon unit out. 3 figures in encounter suits, breath fogging in the night air. The trees rising around them like the walls of something ancient. And they were ancient. That was the first thing that caught him. These were not young trees. They were massive, scarred things, bark thick as armor plating, roots splitting stone. They stood the way something stands when it has been standing longer than most civilizations have been thinking. Grevin raised his scanner. Standard readings. No signals, no movement. He gave the all-clear. It was Orvan who stopped first. He stopped so suddenly that Tasik walked into him. Orvan's arm came up slowly, finger pointing, into the shadow between 2 of the great trees. There was something there. Large, still. The kind of still that isn't absence, but presence. A thing that had decided, deliberately, that movement was beneath it. Their sensors had missed it entirely because their sensors were looking for motion, and this creature had apparently been taught, by 400,000 years of evolution, that patience was more powerful than speed. Grevin, to his credit, did not run. He activated the translator, drew himself up, and in his most official voice said, "Greetings, we come representing the Dominion of..." The creature stood up. Not up into alertness, up onto 2 legs, and it kept going up, and up. It spread its arms wide, and from somewhere deep in its chest, not a throat, not lungs, something older than both, it roared. The sound didn't just hit Vorak's ears, it reached past them, past 31 years of training and service, and touched something at the base of his skull that had been hiding in dark places for a very long time. Something that had learned long before language what sounds like that meant. Run. Grevin ran. Tasik ran. Orvan ran and screamed at the same time, which, under different circumstances, Vorak might have found efficient. The creature dropped back to 4 legs. It sniffed the air, where 3 officers of the Dominion Advance Fleet had just been standing. It made a sound, low, dismissive, the sound of something that has assessed a threat and found it beneath contempt, and walked back into the dark. Silence. On the command deck, nobody moved. Then Vorak's second officer said, very quietly, "Sir, their military databases list that animal as a common wildlife hazard. Hikers are advised to make noise and carry pepper spray." Vorak stared at the tree line. "Pepper spray," he repeated. "A chemical irritant, sold in small canisters, at general stores." Another silence. "Update the threat assessment," Vorak said. They moved to open ground. Lower risk, better sightlines. Scout Vehicle 3 ran an aerial sweep at 8 meters, slow and steady, over a field of tall dry grass turning gold in the first light of morning. Ensign Dreva was at the controls. 3 years in the field, not given to dramatics, which was why, when her voice came flat and careful over the comm, Vorak paid attention. "Sir, I need to log an anomalous behavioral response." He pulled her feed. In the early gold of sunrise, standing in the grass, a creature looked up at the scout vehicle. Medium-sized, long-legged, large dark eyes, an herbivore, prey animal, the kind of animal that, on every other world Vorak had ever visited, existed in a permanent state of biological panic. Hair-trigger nervous systems, ready to run from shadows, from sounds, from anything that didn't belong. The creature looked at the spacecraft. It did not run. It did not freeze in terror. It did not vocalize distress. It stood in the grass, and it looked, with those enormous patient eyes, and it chewed something slowly. The xenopsychology software churned through its models and returned a classification that Vorak read 3 times. Mild interest. No behavioral modification detected. 4 minutes, Dreva said. It hasn't moved. Hold position. 6 minutes. 8. The creature kept looking, kept chewing, blinked its great dark eyes with tremendous, almost philosophical patience. Vorak pulled up the ecological records while he waited. He found the entry he was looking for. This animal, this mild, grass-eating, large-eyed animal, shared its territory with the thing that had just sent 3 of his officers sprinting back to the ship in terror. They lived in the same forests, walked the same ground. The bear was a fact of life here, something to be aware of, something to coexist with. And this creature, this soft prey thing, had looked at an alien spacecraft and decided it was less interesting than whatever it was chewing. At 11 minutes and 14 seconds, the deer turned, walked 30 meters, lay down in the grass, closed its eyes. Silence on the comm line. Then Dreva said, "Sir, I want to flag something." "Go ahead." "If the prey animals here are this calm," she said carefully, "what does that mean for the ones that eat them?" Vorak closed the feed. He didn't answer her. He didn't have an answer that would help. The rancher's property sat alone on flat land, under a wide sky, surrounded by miles of fence line, low-tech, physical, wire strung between wooden posts. A dwelling, livestock in an enclosure, machinery rusting at the edges of the yard. Vorak went himself this time. Full diplomatic array, 2 officers behind him. They came down in full view, no cloaking, lights active, hull plating flashing in the morning sun. 60 meters from the dwelling. A declaration, not a surprise. He wanted the human to see them coming. He wanted the reaction. A man was outside. Middle years of the species' lifespan. Wide-brimmed hat. Work gloves. He was mending a section of fence. Hitting a post with a steel tool. Testing it with his boot. Making quiet decisions about it. He looked up when the ship landed. He looked at the ship. He looked at the 3 of them walking across the field. The suits, the lights, the translator array humming faintly in the morning air. He looked directly at Vorak, with eyes that were neither afraid nor welcoming, just present, the eyes of a man who had a job and was in the middle of it. He looked back at the fence post. His boot tested it again. Insufficient. He reached for a different tool. Vorak walked all the way across that field. The grass was dry and it crunched under his boots. A bird called somewhere. The sky was enormous and very blue. He stopped at protocol distance and activated the translator. "Greetings," he said. "We represent the Dominion of—" "Uh-huh," the man said. The words landed like a door closing quietly. Vorak pressed on. "We come from beyond your star system. We have traveled—" The man had crouched down, examining the wire. Vorak stood in that field, and he felt, for the first time in 31 years, something that took him a moment to identify. Not fear, not confusion, something smaller and stranger than either. It was the feeling of a script running and having nowhere to go, of a key turning in a lock and finding nothing behind the door. He had stood in front of species that wept, species that prostrated themselves, species that scrambled to assemble leadership, to find someone with authority to negotiate surrender. He had stood in front of species that fought, that came out of their buildings with weapons they knew were useless, and used them anyway, out of something that privately Vorak had always respected. He had never stood in front of something that simply had other things to do. "You're not alarmed," he said. It came out less like an observation and more like an accusation. The man stood up, looked at Vorak, direct, unhurried. The eye contact of someone with nothing to prove and nowhere to be that was better than here. Except, and this was the part that lodged in Vorak's chest like a splinter, the fence. The fence. "Should I be?" he said. And the honest answer, the answer Vorak could not say out loud in front of his officers, could not file in any report, could not admit to anyone in the Dominion hierarchy, was, "I don't know anymore. We represent a civilization that spans, I've got 6 miles of fets to check before noon." The man held his gaze for one more moment, patient as the deer, immovable as the trees, and then he turned back to the wire. Vorak walked back to the ship. He had traveled 4 light years. The man had a list. The list was winning. That afternoon, Vorak did something he had never done in 31 years of service. He sat alone in the data room and he read. Not tactical reports, not acquisition assessments. He pulled the historical archives, the ones the survey teams had compiled from intercepted signals and excavated records, and he read the history of the world below. He read about the ice, whole continents buried under glaciers a kilometer thick. He read about the humans who had lived through it, not in great cities, not with technology, with fire and animal skins and sharpened stones, in groups small enough to fit in a single room of his ship, outnumbered, outweighed, out everything, still here. He read about the diseases, a thing called the Black Death that had killed 1 in 3 of them in living memory. He looked at the population charts, expecting a collapse, a long crawl back, the kind of demographic wound that took millennia to close. They were back in 2 generations. He read about the wars they had fought against each other, the sheer industrial scale of it. He read about a conflict less than 100 years ago, in which they had developed, built, and used a weapon that split the atom, the fundamental unit of matter, and he sat with that fact for a while. A species that had been writing things down for less than 6,000 years had figured out how to crack the building blocks of reality and turn them into a bomb. Not because they had been guided to it, not because they had found ancient technology, because they were desperate and creative, and they did not know the word impossible in the way that most species learn to know it. Not the bear from last night. He read about the bears in general. He found that humans, these fragile, short-lived creatures with no claws and no armor and no biological weaponry of any significance, had decided to live near bears, not just because they had to, but because they wanted to. They went into bear territory deliberately. They called it hiking. They called it camping. They found it restorative. There was a practice in one region called bear watching, which was exactly what it sounded like. Humans sitting quietly at a respectful distance, watching bears fish, and feeling something that the translation software rendered as wonder and the word peaceful. They watched the thing that made his officers run. They watched it for fun, for peace. Vorak closed the archive. He sat in the quiet, and he thought about the rancher's eyes, about the deer, about the child from the briefing that had come in from Unit 7 that afternoon, 8 years old, grass stains on her knees, who had looked at an alien officer in a full encounter suit and said, "Cool, are you an alien?" and then asked if the alien species had horses, and upon learning they did not, expressed something that could only be called pity. He thought about what it must take to make something like that. Not the technology, not the civilization, the people, the particular kind of people who could be forged by ice and plague and war and bear country, and come out the other side not smaller, not more frightened, but unbothered, not ignorant of the danger, aware of it, intimately, historically, personally aware of it, and unbothered anyway. Because they had been through worse. Because they were always going to be through worse. Because worse was just Tuesday. Vorak had spent his career weaponizing awe. He had stood in front of species who had never seen anything like him, and watched them fracture under the weight of that. He had always believed that was the great equalizer. That no matter how advanced a civilization became, that first sight, that first incomprehensible reality of not being alone, would reach past all of it and find the soft animal underneath. He had been wrong. He had been wrong because he had never considered a species that had spent 200,000 years being humbled by its own planet. A species that had looked at ice and disease and predators and the unfathomable violence of their own kind, and had learned, deep in the bone, past the brain, at the level of the self, that the universe was large and strange, and full of things that could kill you, and that you got up in the morning anyway, and you fixed the fence, and you watched the bears, and you offered a juice box to whatever strange thing showed up on your porch. Because what else were you going to do? Break? They had broken before. They knew what breaking felt like. They had broken and rebuilt and broken again and rebuilt again so many times that breaking had lost its power over them. It was just another Tuesday. You couldn't conquer something like that with awe. Awe was for things you had never seen before. These people had seen everything. Vorak submitted his recommendation at 0200 hours, ship time, while the blue planet turned slowly in the dark below. He wrote, "I recommend we leave. I recommend we file this report, reclassify this world as a category unknown, and think very carefully before returning. Not because they will fight us. They might. But that is not the reason. The reason is this. We build our empire on a single foundation, the belief that every civilization, when confronted with something greater than itself, will feel small. These people do not feel small. They have been made, by their own brutal history, into something that does not feel small. The ice made them, the plague made them, the bears made them, and they turned around and watched the bears and called it peaceful. We have nothing to offer them that is more frightening than what they have already survived, and nothing to offer them that is more wonderful than what they already find in each other. I do not know what we do with a world like that, but I know what we don't do. We don't land again." He stared at the screen, added one last line. "I think the bear knew. From the moment it saw us, I think the bear knew what we were, and I think the bear made the same calculation I am making now. Not worth it." He transmitted the report, leaned back in his chair, looked out at the blue dot one last time. Far below, on a ranch on the northern continent, a man finished his 6 miles of fence before noon. He drove back to his property. He ate a sandwich on his porch in the afternoon sun. He did not think about the alien ship. He had a list. He was working through it. The ship was already gone. And, 3 years later, the humans found the data relay satellite Vorak had left in orbit. They decoded it in 4 months, which was frankly faster than he would have expected, and exactly as fast as he should have expected. A researcher opened the files on a rainy Thursday and read every word. She laughed out loud at the deer. She read the rancher section twice. She sat quietly for a long time after the ending. Then she opened her recording software and pressed record. The podcast ran for 4 seasons. The episode about the rancher was downloaded 60 million times. A journalist tracked him down for a comment. He said, well, fence needed fixing. The journalist asked if he had anything else to say to the alien civilization that had classified Earth as too dangerous to conquer. He thought about it. "Tell them they're welcome back," he said. "Long as they don't spook the cattle." He went inside. The fence, the journalist noted in her article, was in excellent condition.